Hey everyone, welcome. We'll be starting in about 5 minutes. Oh, Professor May, somebody's here to honor RBG and see Professor May.
Oh, that's so sweet.
I feel like before we start, maybe we should hold up a picture of that cute little grandbaby that you have, just so we can all have some pure happiness in our day.
My my phone, I had to do an update, so
Oh my
it's
gosh.
not available right now.
All
But I
right,
have it on the
well.
fridge. Hold on.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, that reminds me, I'm supposed to say hello from Ingrid to everyone from Porter campus.
Oh,
She said she misses us. We miss her.
I mean, she can come back, right?
Hi, Ingrid.
Oh my gosh, that baby is the cutest.
and my little lamb. Robinson family. Oh, I think that's Tiffany. I think she often has her kids with her on her Zoom calls, which is fun.
Hi, all of my Porter people. I miss you guys.
We miss you too.
Okay, so it's right at 12:30, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Kevin O'Farrell to start our event. We are recording this event, so any questions you might have towards the end, we will definitely get to them. Feel free to write those in the chat. So Dr. O'Farrell.
Hey, thank you, Laura, and welcome everyone this afternoon to what we hope will be a very engaging and informative session. I want to welcome you to what is part of what we call our One Nation event that we have hosted here at the Porter campus for 4 years now. And really, this event has been designed to really promote civic engagement, diversity, inclusion, and understanding. And it's always typically held in the fall, and it takes on significance, especially during a election year, as 2020 is. So we've always had this event to encourage participation in our democracy, to have a sense of awareness, but also to have a place where we can have some meaningful conversations. So I do want to welcome everyone here to this particular event. And I also want to encourage everyone to know that this is an important election this year, and we have an opportunity to cast our votes and to allow our voices to be heard. Early voting in the state of Florida began yesterday on October the 19th. And some of you may have requested absentee ballots, so you had your ballots even before then. But we want to encourage you, whether or not you have a mail-in ballot, or you want to take advantage of early voting, or you want to wait and vote in person on November the 3rd, please make time in your schedule to do that. I can let you know that yesterday I wanted to go and early vote and stood in line. Only took me about 15 minutes. I can tell you that if you are in Pasco County, you can go to Pasco Votes website, and you can actually have a tracker. It will tell you what the estimated wait time is for one of your voting areas, and you can go to any of those operating precincts. You do not have to go to the precinct that you are designated for on election day. So all you need is your ID, and they will take care of you. So I encourage you to get out and vote, make your voice heard, be part of the democratic process. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about what our presentation is going to look like today. We have one of our humanities professors, Professor Whitlock, who will be giving us a great overview primer on the life and work of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the notorious RBG, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But this is a really interesting time because, as many of you know, we've got a Supreme Court confirmation process going on right now. And it's unfortunate that we've lost one of our associate justices, Ruth Ginsburg, who was a remarkable individual with an incredible history and perspective, and has been a real force, I think, in not only the legal community, but a cultural icon. And so we want to have a chance to celebrate her life, her contribution, and to let everyone know a little bit more about who she was and what her background is as we move forward. Just a little bit of trivia about Ruth Bader Ginsburg that kind of, you know, we all have a little bit of tie maybe to Ruth Bader Ginsburg in her life or what she does. But what was always so interesting for me personally is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was actually born March 15th, 1933. March 15th happens to be my sister's birthday, so I always remember the day that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was born because it was the same. And unfortunately, she passed away on September 20th, 2020. She passed away on my mother's birthday, September the 18th. So I always remember when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was born and when she passed away, because it's tied in with family events. But she was an incredible individual, married to an incredible scholar in his own right, Martin Ginsburg. And she was an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, nominated by President Bill Clinton in 1993, and was confirmed by the United States Senate of a vote of 96-3. And she was the second female to serve on that court, and just had an incredible legacy and, again, a reputation. You know, what's so interesting about Ruth Bader Ginsburg is she was really known for her passionate dissents. And I think that's important. A dissent is an opinion that is not the majority's opinion in a court's ruling. So when we talk about dissents, we're talking about how the side that was not the majority in the ruling felt about the issue, because they felt the court should have moved in a different direction. And so they write this dissent. And dissents are important because we can trace throughout legal history when comments and dissents actually make their way into what eventually becomes either the overturning of precedent and a majority opinion. So those dissents that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has written will probably live on in history and will be cited in generations to come, maybe even changing some of the directions and legal opinions as we move forward. But what I think is helpful and what I want to share with everyone before I turn it over to Professor Whitlock is just to kind of give everyone an understanding of the federal judicial system. We have three branches of government. Many of you know the executive branch headed by the President of the United States. We also have the legislative branch in which we have Congress, right? Two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate make up Congress. And then we have the judicial branch. And the judicial branch is where we found Ruth Bader Ginsburg as a Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. In the federal branch of government, we have basically three tiers. We have trial courts, right, which hear questions of fact. We have appellate courts, which hear questions of law. And then we have what are known as the court of last resorts. And in this case, it's the U.S. Supreme Court, which hear questions of constitutional law. So trial courts, questions of fact, these are the courts where you have your juries, where you have people making comments about the who, what, when kind of aspects of law. But appellate courts, which is that intermediate, those deal with questions of law, not questions of fact, but questions of law. And so they are working to decide, was the law appropriately applied? And then there is yet that final court of last resorts, the U.S. Supreme Court, that rules on those constitutional questions of law. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg served not only on the appellate level, but for years, since 1993 until 2020 in her passing, as a U.S. Supreme Court justice, one of 9 justices, very important. So I think it's important to kind of know the context of the system that we find Ruth Bader Ginsburg in. A remarkable trailblazer in many ways. You know, she was a law student when females in law school were not like they are today, very, very few. She was a professor, a litigator, a judge, a justice, and now really a cultural icon. And she has this nickname, the notorious RBG. And with that, I'd like to introduce Professor Rebecca Whitlock, who's going to take this presentation and tell us a little bit more about how she got that nickname and really more about the life and work of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So Professor Whitlock, please take it away. And after we're done, we'll have some panel reflections and questions and answers for our students and those who are attending. So we're looking forward to that. Please, Professor Whitlock.
Thank you, Dr. O'Farrell. I am honored to be part of the One Nation event. Like you, I feel that civil engagement is an essential part of a healthy democracy, and that's what the One Nation event is all about, is civil engagement. And who embodies the concept of civil engagement better than Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Dr. O'Farrell, that was a lovely tribute to a remarkable woman. Indeed, there are many reasons to admire Ruth Bader Ginsburg, regardless of where you might fall on the political spectrum. It was just over a month ago that Ruth Bader Ginsburg died. It was Friday, September 18th, your mother's birthday, the first night of Rosh Hashanah. And her death came at such an intense moment in our nation's history. We've got a global pandemic, we've got an economic crisis, and on top of that, we're also dealing with very intense national reckoning on racial injustice. And by the way, we also have a very contentious presidential election happening in a matter of a few weeks. So to lose this iconic, notorious figure at this particular moment feels poignant and worthy of reflection. And even if you don't know anything about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, just knowing that she was the first woman and the first Jewish person to lie in state tells you a lot about her grit and her perseverance. And it also tells you a lot about where we are in the American journey to equality, how far we've come since our nation was founded over 200 years ago, and how far we still have yet to go. Given RBG's lifelong dedication to civic engagement and equality, it it seems like a fitting time to reflect on her life and her legacy and to engage in a political discussion with all of you. So thank you all of you who have taken the time out of your day to come and be part of this discourse. And I'm particularly grateful to be engaging with the beautiful people on our panel and those working behind the scenes. These are my very favorite people, or some of my very favorite people at Porter campus, and I'm just delighted to have the chance to spend some time and chat with them about this notorious woman that we call RBG. So what is it that makes her notorious? Well, the word notorious essentially means legendary or infamous, and she certainly has taken on a legendary status in our pop culture. You know, she's a regular character on Saturday Night Live. She has an action figure. There's all kinds of accessories that you can purchase that are inspired by RBG, including the Descent necklace that you can purchase from Banana Republic. You know, people are even getting images of this Supreme Court justice permanently tattooed on their body. So, you know, certainly she has achieved a certain legendary, notorious status in our culture. And where does that come from? Well, to answer that question, you have to go back to the beginning, Brooklyn. She was born in Brooklyn, New York in 1933 at the tail end of the Great Depression. Her father was a Ukrainian immigrant. He came here when he was just 15, and her mother's parents were Polish immigrants. And Ruth's mother was a bookkeeper in Brooklyn, and unfortunately she died when Ruth was just 17 years old, but they were very close. And Ruth recalls that her mother, one of her mother's proudest memories was marching with the suffragettes. And this was back when, you know, women were fighting for the right to vote. So I love one of my favorite RBG quotes is, "What's the difference between a Brooklyn bookkeeper and a Supreme Court justice? One generation." You know, so it really shows how much can be accomplished in just one generation. But another reason that Ruth's Brooklyn roots are significant to this question of notoriety is there is also a very notorious figure from contemporary American culture that was also from Brooklyn, and that's the notorious B.I.G. And of course, the notorious RBG is a riff on his name. And while at first glance they don't appear to have a lot in common, I would argue that they both embody that notoriety, that kind of rebellious, defiant questioning of the status quo. And make no mistake, you know, Ruth was had an intense reverence for the law, but she was not afraid to be rebellious and defiant when she felt when she perceived an injustice. And I think part of what made that defiance so notorious was that it came in a very unlikely package. I mean, she's this tiny little person. She's very small and she's very shy and very soft-spoken, but though she be little, she is fierce, you know, to use the words of Shakespeare. She had a lot of reasons to feel intimidated and out of place, but nevertheless, she persisted. You know, she had this incredible grit and perseverance and I think that was the main reason that she became notorious. But she was, throughout her life, constantly defying the status quo and questioning. And the first place that you see her do this is in her education. And so you have to remember that, you know, here we are in college. We're in a college setting. Many of you in the audience are college students. Some of you are women college students. So I want you to just pause and reflect for a minute what the cultural milieu was at the time. There were very rigid gender roles about what women did and what men did. And when she was ready to enter as an undergraduate, you know, it was a time where academic pursuits were really kind of a man's game, and women were really more pushed towards either being a homemaker, or if they did attend college, they generally majored in things like education or nursing or home economics, certainly not law. That was much more rare. So just the fact that she wanted to attend school and major in law immediately set her up to need to be defiant if she was going to achieve her goals. It wasn't illegal for women to go to college, but it certainly wasn't easy. And this is where her defiance came in. And so she attended Cornell University, an Ivy League school. Now Cornell had been admitting women since the 19th century. They were actually the first Ivy League school to admit women. But even in the 1950s, they had a strict quota. And so there were 4 men to every woman. And because of that quota, the women who did get in were the best of the best. They were very bright. And Ruth noticed that sadly, many of these very bright women felt the need to hide their intelligence because at the time, the social norm was that, women, it wasn't attractive or feminine for a woman to be intelligent or ambitious. And so they felt the need to hide that. But she continued to persist, and she ended up meeting her future husband at Cornell, Marty, and she dated a lot as an undergraduate, but Marty was the first one to recognize and appreciate her intelligence. And so she knew he would be a good match for her. And indeed he was. And they intended to go to law school together. But that plan got waylaid a little bit because he got recruited into active military duty. So they spent 2 years in Oklahoma on a military base, and there they had their first child, Jane. And when that active military duty was fulfilled, they were then able to enroll in Harvard Law School in 1956. And again, just like at Cornell, it was there weren't a lot of women attending this program. She was one of 9 women out of a class of 500 men. That's less than 2%. And she said, it was a very intimidating kind of a situation. You kind of felt like you were always on display. You felt like everyone was watching you. When you performed, you were not just performing for yourself, but you felt your performance reflected on all women. So there was a lot of pressure, and she recalls a story of her first year at Harvard. The dean would have hosted dinner and invite all of the women in the class to the dinner, and they were asked to stand and justify why they were taking the place of a man. So it was certainly was a process that was full of challenges and indignities, but nevertheless she persisted and she performed very well. And a big part of why this worked was because of her life partner, Marty. He was a very rare individual for the time, in the sense that he valued Ruth's career just as much as his own. So it was a true partnership. They shared domestic responsibilities as well as child caring responsibilities. And this is really what made all the difference. And I think as Dr. O'Farrell was saying earlier, Marty is a really good example of what a feminist looks like. A feminist is not necessarily a man. And he was actually a really good cook. Ruth was kind of notorious for having really bad cooking skills. And so that was where he shined, and he cooked, and that's not something that was really socially acceptable. It was against cultural norms, but they defied those cultural norms, and they raised their children together. And that Ruth recognizes how important that support from her husband was into her success. So I think that Marty deserves a lot of credit for that. And they have a beautiful family. Her daughter grew up to be a very successful attorney. And her son is actually a classical music producer. So, they successfully parented together as a team. And so she really shined in law school. She graduated first in her class. She was on the law review, which is a very important and distinguished achievement. So she was ready to go out into the world and find a job to practice law. And no one would hire her. You know, regardless of how successful she was in her educational career, she was not employable as an attorney. And the employers were really very vocal and upfront about the fact that they just didn't want to hire a woman. It didn't fit in with their scheme. They felt that those positions should be reserved for men. It was legal for employers to do this at the time. It was legal for employers to fire women for being pregnant. It was legal for employers to pay women less if their husbands had a job. So there was a lot of she was realizing that there were a lot of legal barriers to women's equality. And so, you know, she didn't give up. She decided, well, okay, I'll be a college professor. And she broke a lot of barriers as a college professor. She was the first tenured professor at Rutgers University, and as well as Columbia Law. So, you know, she was breaking barriers, and she was realizing just at this time, she was becoming more aware of the burgeoning feminist movement that took place in the 1960s. So this is the second wave of feminism. So if you go back to the first wave of feminism, that's the suffragettes, and they were fighting for the right to vote. But by the time you get to the 1960s, the feminist movement broadens to include a wider range of issues like workplace inequalities, legal inequalities, family, you know, all kinds of other issues come to the surface. And she definitely felt the need for this movement, but she felt her best way to contribute to this movement was through the law. And so she began working on slowly taking cases that she felt reflected gender-based discrimination, taking those cases to the Supreme Court, and very slowly and methodically bringing these issues to light and rectifying them in the law. And so for that reason, she kind of got the reputation as being the Thurgood Marshall of the women's rights movement. So you may have heard the name Thurgood Marshall. Was a very instrumental figure in the civil rights movement. You might have know him from Brown versus Board of Education. And indeed, she modeled her skills as a lawyer after Thurgood Marshall, that kind of slow, methodical, step-by-step, incremental approach to change. And indeed, and another one of her strategies that proved to be very successful was the fact that she focused on equality for both men and women. So she wasn't so much fighting for women's rights as she was fighting for equality for both men and women. And she would bring cases to light that actually demonstrated that men were suffering as a result of some of these laws. So for example, this is a really interesting one. This is from 1975. This man he was married to a woman. She was pregnant, and she died in childbirth. And here he is, a widower, left with this baby, and he wanted to take care of this baby, to be a stay-at-home dad. But he was not entitled, because he was a man, he was not entitled to the survivor benefits from Social Security. And so RBG took this case and won on behalf of her client, and illustrated how these gendered laws actually impact men in a negative way as well as women. And so this kind of approach was really helpful and eye-opening and effective way to make that incremental change. And just like Thurgood Marshall, she eventually got appointed to the US State Court of Appeals in 1980, and then went on to be a Supreme Court Justice in 1993. And as Dr. O'Farrell mentioned, I really, one of the things that really impresses me, and I think is worth noting about her appointment to the Supreme Court, is that the Senate voted her in 96-3. Mm-hmm. And that at the time, the newspapers described it as one of the most smooth Supreme Court justice appointments in years. So she earns a lot of bipartisan respect. I went back and looked at the footage from her confirmation hearing, which, by the way, you can look at on C-SPAN. They have thousands of hours of this kind of thing. But Senator Orrin Hatch, a very conservative Republican senator, said, I may disagree with you on a lot of things, but you have earned the right, in my opinion, to be on the Supreme Court because I admire you. And just this kind of bipartisan support and respect that RBG garnered, I think, is another reason why she became so notorious. And she carried that bipartisan diplomacy into her work on the Supreme Court. She was famously friends with a very conservative member of the Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia. And although they disagreed fiercely on matters of law, they were really good friends in their personal time. They both loved opera. They went on vacations together. As a humanities teacher, I actually really think it's cool that art is the thing that brought them together, their mutual love for opera. But I think that one of the reasons that so many people admire Ruth Bader Ginsburg is because she modeled this kind of civility, this kind of rational, polite way of being, fiercely defending your opinion, but doing so in a moderate, rational way. And I think that's one of the reasons that people really admire her. And I also think that they appreciate the fact that she is a voice. She is a voice for women in the public sphere where there really wasn't one before, or there wasn't as much of one. And she's this tiny little person. She's a very soft-spoken woman, but she makes her voice heard and she makes her presence known, whether it be through her physical voice or through wearing her dissent collar, where she would put this collar on as a symbol of her dissent if she didn't agree with the outcome of a vote. So it really, I think, is a really important model for all of us of how to make your voice heard. And she's writing these dissents for future generations and to inspire others to keep up the fight, even if you may not be winning in the moment. And I think the other reason that Ruth is considered notorious is because she uses her experience as an outsider, as a woman, to help other marginalized people. And she's really demonstrates an understanding of intersectionality, which is a really important element of today's feminist movement. The idea that oppression comes in a variety of interlocking forms, and that each person's identity is made up of intersecting multiple identities that can include gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, class, ability. So there's a lot of different things that come into play. And I think that when you are an outsider, you're more able to help other outsiders. And I think that she really embodied that. And so although RBG is known for her contributions to women's rights, for her, it was really about realizing equality, the equality principle for all Americans, and to strive for the more perfect union that the founding fathers aspired to. So RBG's work may not be sensational and flashy, and it may not make for good clickbait, but it's the kind of persistence, that head down, nose to the grindstone, never afraid to go against the grain, using your intelligence, using your reason and your logic as a means of creating a more just society, a more equal society, a more perfect union. That is what makes RBG notorious. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Dr. O'Farrell, who will be moderating our panel discussion.
Excellent. Well, I want to say, Professor Whitlock, thank you so much, because you gave just an absolutely classic overview of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and I think just pulled us in so nicely. There's a lot of work and research that you did in that. And I can tell you right now, you're probably like me, I'm like you, I should say. you get into that C-SPAN, you can just watch her confirmation hearing, and you just get sucked in because it's so classic. And I encourage people to take a look at that if you're looking for digging in a little bit more about her background and process. And looking at the confirmation hearing is so important as we keep, again, that in context that we're in the process of that right now today. So I think that's fantastic. But what we want to do now is pivot a little bit and have some reflections from some of the professors that we have here at the world famous Porter campus at Wiregrass Ranch to kind of share their thoughts on Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the impact that she has had on their thought process and reflections that they have on her life. And we have some outstanding professors that are here with us. I'm going to let them give a little wave as I ask them some questions. We have Professor Jackie May. Professor Jackie May works in our English and Communications department, and we're so glad to have her here this morning. We also have Dr. Davina Jones. Many of you know Dr. Jones. Dr. Jones, give us a good little wave there this morning. She is our speech communications instructor with a real focus on social justice issues. We just appreciate her so much. Professor Sarah Fede. Professor Fede, give us a little wave there. We're so glad that you're with us as well. Instructor in mathematics here at the Porter campus. We appreciate you, Professor Fede, for all your hard work. And we also have Professor Glennis Williams. Professor Glennis Williams, give us a little wave there. We're so glad to have you as well, Professor of Information Technology. So this is the ladies who are going to be part of this reflective panel. And I have a couple of questions that I want to ask them and then open for a dialogue. And I also want to say that if you've got a question maybe for one of our panelists or for Professor Whitlock, you can go ahead and enter that into the chat bar and we'll be monitoring those and leave some time at the end for that kind of Q&A session. But Professor May, I want to start with you. And I really want to ask this question. How would you, just very simply stated, how do you believe that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has impacted your life in a personal way?
Well, I cannot imagine or fathom a time when a woman did not have the right to have a mortgage in her own name or a credit card in her own name, or a woman who had to resign because she was pregnant. You know, our generation or the later generations may take that for granted, but I look at my life. I was raised by a single mother whose father was deceased. And if she was not able to get a mortgage or to hold a job, she was the breadwinner in our family. And without her having the right to support us and the ability to support us as a family, that would have been incredibly difficult and unjust. And even in my life, I worked until the very end of my pregnancy. And I did that so I could save enough money to stay home with my children. And that was not seen as shocking, or the fact that a woman would have had to hide her pregnancy for as long as possible and then have to, you know, abruptly leave her career because of a pregnancy is just unfathomable to me. And I'm so grateful to live in the time that we do live, and we should just never forget how it was in generations past.
Well, I think you bring up such an interesting point there, Professor May, is just some of the simple things that today, living in 2020, we think, how could that have ever been? What do you mean as a female, I couldn't have my own credit card? I mean, now we have this kind of joke, if you will, right? There's this almost kind of laughability in modern culture that women have so many credit cards and they just go shopping all over the place and they just run up all this debt. But there was a time when, as a female, you could not get that credit card. It had to be in your husband's name, as if your husband had to vouch for your ability to pay your debts. It's just unfathomable, I think, today. So I just think that everyday kind of thought process is almost lost in contemporary times.
Absolutely, it is. And we should, that's why we have symposia like this, to be reminded of how far we've come and how we can be grateful for people like the notorious RBG who came before us and was a champion for equality.
So let me pivot and ask Professor Sarah Fede. You know, we've talked, Professor Fede, about the work of Justice Ginsburg and thinking about all that she's done to really to strive to accomplish in terms of equality. Do you think, in your opinion, your reflection, do you think we've arrived yet? And what kind of work do you still see on the horizon if we haven't?
Great question. I agree with Professor May in that we have a lot to be grateful for as far as we have come today. I'm glad that we do have the right to vote. We do have the right to own a home and have a credit card and all of these different things, but the work is not done. As I'm sure most of you agree, there is still so much more to do. Recently, I had an opportunity to visit the Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's a remarkable museum. If any of you have a chance to go, I highly recommend it. And they did have a focus on the civil rights, but then they went into human rights. And I know right now we're talking about gender equality and so forth. Eventually, I have a feeling we're going to have to shift to just plain human rights. What is right for just every human being? Because, as we've seen over the years, it's been discrimination based on race, based on gender, based on class, all of these different things. But in that center, they talked about an international agreement on what does it take to just consider basic human rights. And if you don't mind, I'll read part of this to you. It said that basically this is the human rights. It's just the opportunity to be able to think and speak freely, to vote, to receive a basic education, and to be free from torture or enslavement, among others. These are innate, and people are born with these rights and always have them just because they are human. And so it talks about, these are things that we should have regardless of whether or not the person in charge agrees. These are basic human rights. And so I still feel like we have a long way to go. In the center, they talked about, places where there are still dictators today. And the things that are happening, like in North Korea and in Syria, and places where, we get our clothes from. I mean, it makes it, after going through here, you almost don't want to buy any more clothes or even chocolate. They talked about children that are in these countries having to collect the cocoa beans and the conditions that they're living in and being forced to work. And so as a person who loves chocolate, it just gave me another perspective on what's going on. So yes, I'm grateful for all that's been accomplished. I do not believe the work is done. And I believe it's going to be this generation and generations to come that are going to have to continue to fight against these things. I remember there's a saying that says, bad things happen when good people do nothing. And so when we see an injustice, we're going to have to be brave, like RBG, sorry. And we're going to have to speak up against these injustices, no matter what it is, gender, race, economic, social class, whatever it is. Sorry.
Well, Professor Fede, as you're talking, the one word that really comes into my mind is the word stewardship. And what I mean by that is, as Professor Whitlock laid out, we talk about feminism, the first wave of feminism, the second wave of feminism, that you're able to make accomplishments. You're able to keep pushing forward because you're standing on the shoulders, if you will, of those who've come behind you. But with that is this whole concept of being good stewards of what you have been given and not taking that for granted and then saying, what do I do to move to the next level, to push the agenda forward? Because sometimes we may not be able to see within our lifetime what we ultimately can envision in our minds, but we have to be solid stewards of what we've been given. So let me just ask you a follow-up question. We're in an election cycle here. I mean, we have an opportunity for our voice to be heard on a wide range of issues. How do you think that concept of stewardship is really important when we think about voting?
I think it's huge. I know a lot of times people will say, oh, well, what does my one vote matter? But it does matter. And think about the lives that were sacrificed so that we could have that right to vote. And so it is so important to go out and let your voice be heard and not let it go by the wayside. This is a right that we have been given that so many have sacrificed for us to have. And it is an opportunity for us to let our voices and our opinions and our desires for the future be known. So your voice, your vote, your voice does count. Please get out and vote.
Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate that. I echo that. I think everyone else does as well. And I want to pivot to Professor Williams, and I want to ask this question. Professor Williams, I know you're familiar with this, and for those of you who are watching, maybe you have not seen, there's actually a movie, a great movie called On the Basis of Sex, that really just kind of gives a great artistic portrayal of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's life. And there's an interesting scene in that movie in the very beginning. Professor Whitlock talked about it when Ruth Bader Ginsburg is one of the 9 females admitted in the class of nearly 500 men at Harvard Law. She's at the dean's house for a dinner. And just as Professor Whitlock describes, all the women are asked to stand up and to justify why they're there, why they've taken the place of a man. And you just kind of, as you're watching this, it is such an uncomfortable scene. It should make you feel uncomfortable thinking like, oh my goodness, what if I were at this dinner party? Or what if I were one of these women? What would I say? Let me ask you the question, Professor Williams. Do you believe that, that Ruth Bader Ginsburg's work has helped to reduce some of these instances? Or do we even still have some instances today where we have to be mindful of discrimination on the basis of sex and gender?
We absolutely do. Watching that movie, I was actually outraged. I couldn't believe that the women had to justify why they were in college, why they were at Harvard Law School. They were paying the same amount of money as the men. They had the same qualifications. Maybe they were even more qualified because they had to be the top of the top, the best of the best. So as I'm watching this movie and one of the ladies began to answer, her answer wasn't good enough for the dean. And so I became even more upset thinking, wow, I can't believe this. So I love the way that Justice Ginsburg handled the situation. I don't want to give it away, but it's kind of like my personality. She stepped out of the box and she did something that was not in the norm so that she can divert the attention and the tension of the atmosphere. And I thought that was brilliant. So the fact that she was comfortable in herself, being able to express, wait a minute, this is not quite right, but I'm not going to handle it a traditional way, get mad, upset, angry. I'm going to do it a little differently, and maybe I can change the atmosphere. I thought that was amazing.
Let me ask you, Professor Williams, you are from a discipline, information technology.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think there's some interesting parallels when we talk about, you know, STEM, you know, science, technology, engineering, math, and we talk about trying to get larger numbers of women embracing those particular fields. You've been in a field where women are a very, very small minority. What do you think we need to do to encourage more women to pursue information technology, science, engineering, mathematics as a viable discipline and career? What can we do to cultivate and encourage that?
I'm so glad you asked. So when Justice Ginsburg was in college around 1956, that was just a few years, well, quite a few years before I went to college. And I was in a classroom or in a general assembly very similar to hers, looking around, asking myself, where are the women? Because of the technology field that I'm in. Not only that, you may not have noticed, but my skin color is slightly different than hers. So I'm looking around looking for women. I'm looking for people of my same race. I'm looking for someone like me. And that wasn't the case. So I really can relate to that. One of the things that really encouraged me to keep going, and I try to do the same thing with women and everyone else interested in this field, just don't stop. Just keep pursuing, don't stop. A lot of times people may make you feel as if you're not confident, you're not competent, you're not able to understand things, which Justice Ginsburg experienced. I experienced that as well. I even was asked at one point, oh, you're going to college, so you're going to be a secretary. So the way to handle it is not to get mad, but to just keep pursuing, keep believing. There are so many things out there that can be done, but what about the things that haven't been discovered yet? There's potential in everyone. So I would encourage people that may be thinking about information technology, the computer science field, keep believing, keep asking, keep seeking. Come see me. I'll be glad to talk to you about it.
I love it. Thank you, Pro G. You got me. I'm ready to sign up. I love that. Dr. Jones, I've got a question for you. And I want to take a little bit of a look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg's role on the U.S. Supreme Court and even her role on the appellate court there in D.C. But, you know, sometimes you'll hear this phrase, activist judges. And that's a very loaded concept. You know, do you feel that Ruth Bader Ginsburg was an activist judge, or what do you think about even the use of that term activist judge in a legal context?
Well, very fitting question. I absolutely have some reflections about it. Most of you know my background is in communication studies, and I love looking at the nuances of language. So I do have some thoughts about how we language that question. Even some of the ways we language our reference to Ruth Bader Ginsburg with Notorious B.I.G. and so forth. But I desire to pause just a little bit, because there's a part of this that you may be able to explain certainly much better than I, because I think there's a backdrop to that in terms of your background is political science. So I do desire to answer your question, but can I cheat? And can you give us maybe just a little insight from a political science perspective about the definition of that term and some other definitions in there? And then I do desire to give some reflections from the communication lens that I'm very passionate about. Can we do that a little bit?
Absolutely, we could do that, Dr. Jones, and I'll share just a quick little thumbnail sketch there. Typically, you'll hear certain individuals who will comment and say activist judge, meaning, you know, really when you begin to pull that back, sometimes you'll hear that maybe from strict constructivists. Strict constructivists would simply say that the law only means what the law says, and that it should be interpreted only based on what is there. There are some challenges to the strict constructivist in terms of how purist they become, because in reality, we know from a conceptual standpoint that words have a conceptual meaning beyond them. For instance, in the Constitution, there is no term woman. Woman is not in the Constitution. But I think in today's day and time, we would not think that women should not be included under the Bill of Rights and have access to those rights and protections. So to say that someone's an activist judge may be actually a reaction against an individual who does not like the opinion of the judge or the justice. And so therefore, the opinion is seen as action taken to undermine what they believe is a strict constructivist interpretation of the law. So I think it goes maybe to your area of specialty, which is this idea of language. How important is it for us to first understand before we go out and try to create a heuristic label, when really the intent has nothing to do with the label that's associated or placed on that individual or item?
Yes, I agree. So that gives me some context from the standpoint of political science. And so with that, yes, I think language, we use language the way we desire to use it. I call it coding. And so in my classroom, from time to time, I do a little curriculum piece about coding. I'm a Southern girl. I was born and raised here in Florida. And so there are times when, you know, maybe I meet someone and they say, so where are you from, or where do you live? And I say, I live in Wesley Chapel. And they may say, oh, country girl, you know, like, oh, okay, yeah. Or they may say, oh, kind of country. It's the same word, but it carries different intonations. It carries different meanings, different connotations. And so I think we willfully use terms like activist judge in particular, when we simply just, the person doesn't agree with us. You know, right now we celebrate things like Martin Luther King Jr. Day or whatever, some people do. And, you know, it's customary and it's proper to say nice things about Dr. King. You know, in January on his birthday, it's nice to say nice things about King. But we didn't say nice things about King when he was doing the actual work. He was an agitator. Mm-hmm. When he came to town, he was an agitator. Mm-hmm. He was not a civil rights activist. He was an agitator. And even Black people sometimes felt uncomfortable working with King. Like, you're going to get us killed. You know, we're going to be on the tree tomorrow because you came to our town. And so that's how we referred to him. And I even listened, rightfully so, as my dear colleague, one of my favorite people at Porter, Professor Whitlock, even as she describes properly in popular culture how we have referred to the Notorious B.I.G. and this label of the Notorious I always say it wrong, RGB. RBG.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you got it. RBG.
Yes.
And we use the term, you know, because she pictures for us this defiance, and he pictures for us this defiance. Well, it just depends on how we look at it. And so Professor Whitlock, she used that term very appropriately in terms of how the general public may see these figures. Defiant. But are they defiant or are they passionate?
Right.
See, when it's us making our point, we're passionate.
Yeah.
But because their point is different, they're defiant.
Mhm.
So was the Notorious B.I.G. defiant or passionate? Was Ruth Bader Ginsburg defiant, an activist judge, or was she a passionate judge? So the language plays a part in terms of who authored the language, and what our intentions were in that authoring. Did I answer?
I was gonna say, I think, Dr. Jones, you just bring up an excellent point, which I think is something we can all take away from, is when you hear particular labels, you can take the label at face value, but then do the critical analysis to see what is the thought process behind assigning that label. And, you know, I've often used that, you know, this is a great example. You know, one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. One person's protester is another person's, you know, criminal. So I think labels, language is so important that we look beyond that to really look at what is going on here, try to understand that, ask the critical questions so we can glean something out of that. So yeah, I hear that. I have a question that I want to ask Professor Whitlock as we're getting into just a few questions here just for the group. But, you know, how important, and you mentioned this because I just find this to be so compelling, you know, that we can all as individuals put ourselves in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's shoes, and we can say, who is it in our lives that we surround ourselves with to be part of our success network? And by that, I mean, you know, each of us need people in our lives to help us be successful. And when you look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you see the incredible choice she made in her husband, Martin Ginsburg, who really aligned with her values, aligned with her thought process, and was very much, I think, instrumental in helping support her so that she could become all that she had the potential to be. At the same time, she was incredibly supportive of her husband. So can you just maybe add a little bit to the flavor about how important it is to allow people into our lives who are there for our success and want to see us grow successfully?
Absolutely, and Marty actually reminds me a lot of my husband. You know, that is an instrumental part of feminism, is having the men in your life recognizing that, you know, sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, well, I don't really understand why there's a need for feminism right now. You know, don't women have rights? And I think that when people say that, they're losing sight of all of those little things that impact women on a daily basis. Cultural norms, social pressures. There's a lot of things that we do on a daily basis because that's what we were programmed to do. That's what we saw our parents do. That's what we see a lot of, you know, a huge bulk of the population doing. And if you don't stop and be mindful about why you're making the choices that you're making, it's so easy to just fall into that, I'm doing it because just that's the way that it's always been done. But I think it's really important to pause and reflect about the choices that you're making and be very mindful about how you proceed. Be mindful about the partners that you choose in your life, and be mindful about all of those all of those little pressures that you're hearing, and asking yourself, as you said, being critical, using your critical analysis skills to say, is that really what I want to do? Is that really the path that I want to follow? Because so often, I know some of the people who are older like me, 10 years will go by and you'll be like, why did I make that choice 10 years ago? And it's really important to always be mindful and to have people who support you in that mindfulness and to
Absolutely.
lead.
Awareness, right? The sense of mindfulness is so critical, that we have this kind of idea of being able to self-reflect and grow from that. This has been absolutely the most exciting discussion. I literally have like 7 more questions that I want to ask, but I do want to pause and give an opportunity. We may have some questions in the chat bar that Laura Raposa has been monitoring, and I do want to give our participants an opportunity to ask a question. So Laura, could you just let us know, is there a question that may be a great one for our panel to take a look at? And I'd love to hear what that is and feed that out to one of them.
There has not been any questions in the chat, but, oh, just kidding. Aubrey said, I would like to hear opinions on the modern day feminist movement, third wave feminism.
All right, excellent. Professor Whitlock, I'm gonna throw that right out to you. Third wave of feminism. What are we thinking about at this point?
Well, as I mentioned before, intersectionality is a really important part of the current feminist movement. So expanding, I have some resources that I can suggest if you would like to expand your learning on this. But just understanding that as Professor Fede was saying, it's not just about women's rights; it's about human rights. And so I think as a woman, we can use our experience being marginalized and all of those little discriminations that don't even register on a lot of people's radars. We can use that experience to help other marginalized people. And so intersectionality is a really big part of the current feminist movement. If you would like to learn more about what's going on, I really recommend reading Toni Morrison, Bell Hooks. Those are really good authors. Roxane Gay is another really good one on intersectionality. But if you would like to just kind of, these are some books that I've read recently that really speak to what's going on right now. If you're looking for resources, these Amelia and Emily down here, they're really applying a lot of really practical wellness, research-based wellness practices that are helpful for feminists who are feeling a little bit overwhelmed right now with everything going on. They have a really cool podcast if you'd like to learn more. Melinda Gates wrote a book recently that I would really recommend, especially if you're in the tech industry. Professor Williams, I was thinking about you here. She really hit home to me how important it is, how few women are in some of these very important industries like artificial intelligence and cloud computing and data. And if women are not in those industries, that's what's shaping our world right now. And if there's not a woman's voice in that community, that's a problem. If you would like to learn more about the second wave of feminism, there's a really good series on Hulu called Mrs. America that kind of, Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually makes an appearance. It's fictional, but this Mona Lisa Smile it kind of gives you a picture of what the college experience was like back in the 1950s. The Feminine Mystique is a fundamental primer on the second wave of feminism. That's also a very good read. And of course, if you want to learn more about RBG, I think that our librarian, our Porter campus librarian, mentioned that On the Basis of Sex is available at the library. There's a great documentary on various places called RBG that's more of like a documentary style. And then there's a really great book that is at the Porter campus library. This is a great introduction to her life.
Let me stop you right there, Professor Whitlock, because I want to take this idea about the third wave of feminism, and I want to pivot to Dr. Jones on this too, because I think this is something that I think is important to keep in mind, is that every moment when you're living in the moment is described in a certain way, experienced in a certain way, but then you'll see as history moves and people move out of that moment that it's often looked as a different way. So just as you mentioned with Dr. King, when Dr. King was going, Dr. King wasn't as popular towards the end of his life. He was not facing the kind of accolades that we give to him now. When we think about the third wave of feminism, I mean, we look back now and we think about the first wave of feminism. We think about the suffragettes. We're like, yes, they should all be wearing white, great solidarity. Women should be voting. If you were to go back in a time machine, these women were demonized for what they were doing. And you know, I think there's something to be said about how we keep social movements and civil rights in context of how they're going to be experienced and how they're going to be remembered. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. You know, the Me Too movement, there are many individuals that salute and celebrate that movement. But I think the hearing, and not because, let me say this right before I finish my statement. I have been a registered Republican and a registered Democrat. I'm not loyal to the letters. I would never make a great politician because I am not loyal to those letters and I'm not loyal to those camps. So it's important for me to say this because of what I'm about to say. When we saw the hearing of Brett Kavanaugh, and we saw how Christine Blasey was demonized for just telling her story. That's all she did was that. I thought we had graduated much more from when Anita Hill told her story during the hearing of Justice Clarence Thomas. And to see how this woman had to be removed from her home because she was telling her story. I wasn't there, so I don't really know what happened. But I thought that we could have given her a much more dignified space in the public court of opinion to share that story. And so I think my quickest answer, because I see the clock is not so in our favor to continue, but I think my quickest answer is that it is important that these discussions continue to happen. Because Ruth Bader Ginsburg was influenced by her mom's narrative in the home. There was a discussion happening right in her living room before she became Supreme Court Justice. So I think in our living room, I think the question becomes, how are we talking in our living room? We get so focused about the White House, but the White House is a reflection of what's going on in your house, in our houses. The White House just doesn't appear. Everything, good, bad, and different, no matter who's in the White House, it reflects what conversations we vote based on the conversations we're having in our house, in our physical home, and right here in this house, in our house of consciousness. And so moving forward, it is important that we continue to read, we continue to have these types of discussions because we evolve in how we language and how we reflect. There are many, when I wrote my last thing I would say, I promise, when I wrote my dissertation 20 years ago, 2006, December 2000 is when I submitted that dissertation. I stand by maybe half of what I've said, and I've migrated on half of what I've said. And so it's just important that we continue to allow ourselves to evolve in consciousness on all matters.
Well, that's a great way, and I'm going to have to wrap it up, my friends. There are some more questions in the chats. I have some more questions, but we do want to be respectful of everyone's time. But I do want to say this to everyone who's joined us. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for Professor Whitlock for your great presentation. Thank you, Professor May, Dr. Jones, Professor Fede, Professor Williams for being part of this reflective conversation. And I really want everyone to take this. Please, please, please. If you take anything away, you must constantly be a lifelong learner, a critical thinker, and take that knowledge and put it into action. We have an opportunity to have our voices heard. We want to encourage you to be involved in voting, exercising that right, being good stewards of what you've been given, and using that for good. And we hope that this presentation has sparked some thoughts and conversations in your mind. I hope it's sparked some ideas about how you want to go deeper and dig a little bit deeper into these kinds of issues. But we do want to say thank you for joining us. Thank you for being with us. Thank you to Student Life and Leadership for helping put this together. Laura Raposa and your team, I appreciate it so much. My friends, have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you for being here for One Nation 2020. And from the Porter campus, we're signing off saying, I hope everyone has a wonderful day and get out and vote. Take care, my friends.
Bye-bye.